In the medieval world, battlefields were only the beginning of suffering. Victory for one side meant not just the death of warriors, but the destruction of households, where women became the most vulnerable targets of conquest. Defeated families often faced humiliation, designed to break entire lineages, with wives and daughters treated as spoils that carried symbolic weight far beyond material plunder. These actions were not simply random acts of cruelty. They were part of a larger system of power, revenge, and control that turned private life into an extension of war. For many defeated men, the thought of what awaited their families was a fate considered even more unbearable than death in combat. Number 1. The brutality of medieval war. In the Middle Ages, victory rarely ended on the field. It bled into streets, homes, and sanctuaries, where conquest turned private life into a second battlefield. Customary law of arms prized plunder, and once a town fell by storm, rather than negotiated surrender, soldiers expected open license. That expectation shaped tactics. Chevauché fast raids meant to burn crops, seize livestock, and terrify civilians, worked because fear of sack was as decisive as any cavalry charge. Inside a besieged place, everyone became a bargaining chip. Elite captives were ransomed. Ordinary families had far fewer protections, and women faced the heaviest pressure taken as hostages to force compliance, coerced into servitude, or compelled into unions that erased their status and folded them into the conqueror's household. Nothing about this was random. It was strategy. Breaking lineage and honor undermined the defeated warrior long after his sword dropped. Armies knew it, lords tolerated it, and chroniclers recorded it with a mix of ritual language and grim familiarity. Clerical voices tried to impose restraints, but enforcement was weak compared with the rewards of pillage distributed to keep troops loyal. The difference between a negotiated capitulation and a breached wall could mean the difference between relative order and days of chaos. During long sieges, hunger and desperation primed both sides for extremes. Defenders fought on because they understood exactly what a sack entailed. Attackers hardened because prolonged campaigns demanded payoff. Even the image of chivalry, often cited as a moral shield, applied unevenly mostly to nobles who had ransom value and networks of kin ready to retaliate. Common households lived in the shadow of a harsher rule, where property, bodies, and futures were part of the spoils. The cruelty functioned as policy. Punish resistance, advertise dominance, and make the next town open its gates without a fight. Number 2. The siege and its aftermath. A siege did not finish when the gate splintered. It shifted from organized combat to controlled chaos, and that shift determined what happened inside the walls. Once a breach was forced, the rule of the day was the sack. A customary payoff that let troops plunder for a set window, unless commanders clamped down fast. Negotiated surrender could soften the blow-safe conduct, hostages exchanged, ransom lists drawn up. But a city taken by storm usually faced collective punishment meant to make the next garrison think twice about resisting. Families bore the weight of that message. Households were sorted in crude triage, nobles with ransom value, skilled townsfolk needed for repair and supply, the rest exposed to seizure, coercion, and dispersal. Women stood at the center of that coercion because kinship and inheritance ran through them in daily life. Forced servitude in victors' camps, compelled unions to bind local elites to the new order, and relocation as war booty functioned as policy tools, not accidents of rage. Clergy tried to shield non-combatants in churches, but sanctuary often failed once commanders rewarded loyalty with open plunder. Quartermasters moved quickly, tagging valuables, organizing auctions, and assigning shares so officers kept discipline by promising payment after the frenzy. The longer a siege dragged on, the harsher the payback tended to be, because hungry, unpaid men demanded compensation. For defenders, this calculus shaped choices weeks earlier. Burned the suburbs, hoard grain, refuse parley, and gamble everything on holding out, knowing that a broken defense put wives and daughters at the mercy of victors. For attackers, terror had utility beyond the loot. Stories of towns sacked and families broken traveled faster than cavalry, opening gates elsewhere without a fight. After the smoke lifted, the aftermath kept working. New lords resettled households, rewrote marriage ties, and used hostages to police the peace. What looked like senseless cruelty on the surface acted as a rough kind of statecraft domination, etched into streets, contracts, and family lines. So the next banner on the horizon wouldn't need to fire a single trebuchet stone. Number 3. Knights and the Code That Failed. The famous code of chivalry promised restraint, mercy, and guardianship of the weak, but on campaign, it bent under pay arrears, hunger, and the crude economics of medieval war. Knights trained for tourneys and line of battle charges spoke the language of honor, yet the real rules were ransom rights for elites and plunder for everyone else, and those incentives narrowed protection to women of rank whose families could retaliate. Common households lived where banners ended and accounting began. After a gate fell, officers parceled spoils to keep discipline, and the gap between chivalric sermons and street-level practice became obvious. Church efforts like the Peace and Truce of God tried to fence off non-combatants, but enforcement depended on the same lords who owed men their wages in loot, so the moral net tore whenever a siege ran long, or a chevauchee needed to make an example. Ideology also carved loopholes. Labeling opponents as heretics, pagans, or distant others made restraint feel optional and turned private violence into an extension of victory. The code was most visible in ritual oaths, heraldry, courtly rhetoric, while the engine of war ran on contracts and consequences. Retinues recruited with promises, captains judged by results, and garrisons cowed by tales of towns that resisted and paid dearly. Inside that framework, wives of defeated warriors lived under threats that punished entire lineages' forced servitude, coerced pairings to stitch conquered communities into a new order, and hostage-taking to police the peace. Even respected military orders could slide when supply broke down, or commanders looked away. Chroniclers recorded pious prefaces, alongside matter-of-fact lists of seizure and customary liberties after a stormed wall, which says more than any poem about how ideals failed in practice. The code never fully vanished. It simply worked like a door held open for the powerful and closed on the powerless. And in that closing lay the quiet, enduring damage that outlasted trumpets and victory prayers. Number 4. The role of fear and power. Fear in medieval war worked like a tool carried alongside pikes and crossbows, shaping choices before a single ladder hit a wall, and lingering long after banners came down. Commanders counted on it to make towns hesitate, garrisons bargain badly, and defeated households accept new masters, and nothing amplified that fear more than the control taken over families of fallen fighters, because honor, inheritance, and everyday survival ran through the domestic sphere. So seizing wives as hostages for good behavior, attaching them to new households through coerced unions, or forcing service inside victors' camps turned private life into leverage that policed the peace. These measures sent a message with more reach than any patrol, since rumor traveled quickly along markets, pilgrim roads, and taverns, teaching neighboring places that resistance risked not only lives, but futures. Power operated through paperwork as much as raw force, with bonds, oaths, and sureties written after the smoke cleared, and women named directly or indirectly in those deals pledges to guarantee tax deliveries, to keep bridges open, to surrender hidden arms, so a household's safety hinged on obedience, and captains could tighten or loosen terms at will. The same calculus shaped pre-battle behavior, because defenders who knew a storming would void restraint sometimes torched suburbs and fought to the last, while attackers who needed a quick win hinted at mercy only if gates opened, making terror and clemency two sides of one policy. Church sanctuary offered brief shelter, but wavered when pay, hunger, and revenge pulled in the other direction. And once plunder shares were promised, discipline often meant channeling harm rather than stopping it. In that environment, the wives of defeated warriors became the quiet hinge of power. Used to break lineages, to redirect loyalties, and to mark the new order as permanent. So fear did not end at the ditch, but lived in kitchens, marriage contracts, and naming of heirs, reinforcing rule without keeping a single squad on the street. Number 5. Religion and justification. In the medieval world, religion was not just about faith, it was also a tool for power. Church leaders often spoke of war as a holy duty, describing campaigns as sacred missions that could cleanse sins and promise salvation. This gave soldiers a sense that violence was not only permitted, but blessed, which made it easier to commit acts they might otherwise hesitate to do. When a city fell, the treatment of the defeated, especially the women, was shaped by this mindset. By calling enemies infidels or heretics, conquerors stripped them of dignity and protection, suggesting that what was done to their families was justified by divine will. At the same time, there were movements within the church that tried to set limits. The peace and truce of God was meant to shield peasants, women, and clergy from the worst of the violence, restricting when and how knights could fight. Councils condemned assaults on innocents, and sanctuaries were meant to be safe spaces. Yet these rules were often ignored, especially after long sieges. Armies were fueled by hunger, debt, and promises of plunder. Commanders used the prospect of looting and control over the defeated population as a way to maintain discipline among restless soldiers. Religious authorities sometimes responded by imposing penances or encouraging victors to donate spoils to the church, but these gestures rarely undid the harm. For the families caught inside the walls, the religious justifications often deepened the tragedy. Wives of fallen warriors could be forced into marriages with enemies, a move that was presented as merciful because it spared them execution. But in truth, it stripped them of identity and bound them to the conqueror's household. Children born from such unions carried a mark that followed them for life, often excluded from inheritance or treated as outsiders. Chronicles written in monasteries would describe elaborate processions of thanksgiving after victories, but hidden in the same records were notes about seized women, destroyed homes, and coerced communities. Religion provided language that made conquest appear righteous, yet in practice it masked violence and left scars on families that lasted for generations. Number 6. The legacy of suffering. The fall of a city in the Middle Ages rarely ended with the last clash of swords. When banners were lowered and walls breached, the consequences reached deep into private life. Families were torn apart, and the social fabric of entire communities was reshaped in ways that could last for generations. Widows suddenly found themselves without protection, forced to manage farms or households alone, often under the eye of a hostile new lord. Daughters were married off against their will, used as bargaining chips to tie local elites to the conquerors. Children were taken from their homes and placed under foreign guardianship, ensuring loyalty through control of the next generation. Feudal law made this easier. A lord held the right to decide a widow's remarriage or claim the wardship of heirs, so consent was often a formality. In documents of the time, words like raptus blur the line between abduction and violation, leaving victims with little chance of justice. Records from local courts show land disputes labeled as vacant through war, a sterile phrase that hid the reality of burned villages, murdered men, and women coerced into new households. The church tried to limit such excesses with rules like the peace and truce of God, or by offering sanctuary in holy places, but these protections often collapsed under pressure from hungry soldiers demanding rewards or leaders enforcing submission through fear. Over time, rulers realized that unchecked plunder weakened their own control, so policies shifted toward managed domination, offering amnesties, exacting ransoms, or arranging forced marriages, rather than allowing open chaos. Even so, the memories of sack and violation survived in songs, chronicles, and whispered family stories. Tales of women taken from churches or forced into the households of enemies became warnings that lingered long after the battles ended. The real legacy was not just political change, but generations of trauma, broken kinship lines, and communities that rebuilt on foundations of silence and loss. This enduring impact reveals how medieval warfare destroyed far more than fortifications. It reached into the most intimate spaces of life, leaving wounds that outlasted the clash of arms.